Hi everyone, my name is Leanne and today I'm going to be bringing you my February wrap-up, so little mini reviews of everything that I read in February. I think I've got about 14 books to get through today, but before I get into the reviews I want to just quickly mention that the Irish Readathon has started. If you don't know what I'm on about when I say the Irish Readathon, I will leave my announcement video linked down below in the description for you to check out, but essentially it's a reading initiative where myself and my two co-hosts, Aoife and Elaine, encourage the reading bookish community to read more Irish literature than they normally would, and all you have to do to participate is read one Irish book in the month of March. I do have a very sore throat today. I've been having many a strepsil and many a cup of lemsip, but I've got a cup of tea at the moment, so hopefully that's going to help my poor little throat. So I may be quite brief with some of these reviews because I'm in pain. I've got more kids and YA books than I normally do in a month, so I think I'm going to start with those. First up I have The Black Flamingo by Deena. This one is quite shiny because it's a library copy, and this is an amazing queer story told in verse, and I love YA books that are told in verse. This follows our main character Michael from his childhood all the way up to his university life, and it explores him looking at his own identity in terms of his sexuality, his gender identity, what it's like being mixed race, the intersection of all of those identities, looks at his journey into discovering drag culture, and him developing his skills as a poet. One of the things I really loved about this book was like the mixed formats in it, so there are some pages where there's white font on black pages, there are illustrations in it, and when it comes to Michael's poetry, it's as if Michael has torn out pages from his notebook. There are also like text message conversations in this book. I think it's just absolutely fantastic. I read this in 2 sittings. You could read it in 1. It's just a fantastic queer story that I would really recommend. And what I love about it is that it doesn't shy away from the difficult experiences that Michael has, but ultimately it is a very positive queer story. I have The Secret of Platform 13 by Eva Ibbotson. This one originally came out in the 1990s, but this is a reissue of it with this gorgeous cover. It's a middle grade book and it is so much fun, and you may even be able to tell this from the title, but there is a lot of stuff in this book that I can really see how it inspired the Harry Potter series. In this world there is like a magical kingdom called the Island, which you can get through to from our world in a like secret passage under platform 13 at King's Cross Station. Are you seeing the parallels? Like, portal of getting through is open for 9 days every 9 years, and if you miss that window you ain't getting forwards or backwards. And this book follows 4 mysterious figures who are on a mission through the streets of London to find a prince that was stolen from this kingdom 9 years ago. When they eventually find this prince, he's really not what they expected him to be like. I thought this book was so much fun. I know I would have loved this if I read this when I was in that kind of age group. If you like middle grade, if you like magic, then you are gonna love this one. It's utterly charming. There are so many like really memorable, quotable lines in there. I think it's just amazing middle grade and I can't recommend it highly enough. I can't wait to read the second book in this series. This month I also read Becoming Deena by Kit Duvall. I have read one of Kit Duvall's previous books, My Name is Leanne, and I really enjoyed it, and this is her YA debut. In this book we follow 17-year-old Deena, who decides that she needs to get away from her life in this like commune. She ends up hitchhiking, she ends up driving this like van with a guy that only has one leg. She's grappling with trying to get away from her identity. She shaves her hair off, and on this strange and bizarre journey that she is taking alongside this man with one leg, it leads her to confront a lot of the stuff from her past. This book is also inspired by Moby Dick, which is a book that I've never read before, so I don't really know what it's like to have read it from that perspective, and I think most of the people who are reading this book, you know, its primary audience probably haven't read Moby Dick. This story definitely stands alone without any knowledge of that. I thought it was a really great book. I don't think it's one of the best YA books I've ever read. I definitely preferred My Name is Leanne. I thought that was a much better book. I did think it was great to see, you know, this young girl going off and, you know, escaping from what she doesn't want to be in anymore, developing her independence, coming to understand herself more. I thought that was all great, but it wasn't a particularly page-turning plot, I guess is my only criticism. This month I also read Beauty and the Bin by Joanne O'Connell. This is a proof that I pinched from work and I don't have it with me anymore. But I thought this book was so much fun. This follows a teenage girl, our protagonist, who her family are very into being eco-friendly, and one of their like main things is they go like dumpster diving, is that what it's called? But basically like they rummage through bins at the back of supermarkets to get things that they've thrown out but are still perfectly good to eat. Everything they do in this family is very environmentally aware, and our main character is really into making beauty products from like natural ingredients from like fruit and like stuff like that. And when her school began to host a like entrepreneurial business competition for like the team that can make the most money from a business idea, she enters into a business with one of the school's like most popular girls. A few things go wrong along the way, and also our main character has to decide, you know, between her principles of being like friendly to the environment and the things that are going to make her most popular and make her the most money. I thought this book was a lot of fun. I learned a lot from it, and also what I found so captivating about this book was its depiction of social media. Like, this school basically has like this mini like influencer network, and I was like, are teenagers these days like actually that clued up on social media to the point where there's like microcosms and people are like influencers within their school? Like, that just wasn't a thing when I was a teenager. Like, influencer culture was only gradually starting to happen when I was a teenager. I just found this book so interesting and I learned so much from it, and I think, you know, if you are someone who's going to be interested in a like eco-friendly themed YA book, then, you know, this is just perfect. Next up, I read Elizabeth Acevedo's With the Fire on High. This is a YA book that is set in, I think it's set in America, and it is about a high school senior who is also a mother, and it's about her balancing those two things. Balancing her studies with being a responsible parent, alongside help from her abuela. Looks at all of the complications involved in that, you know, down to tiny little things like a staff member in her school not knowing that she has a child and needs to have her phone on her for that reason. One of the things I didn't enjoy so much about this book was like the romantic kind of like love triangles that are in that, but I understood why they were in there, because that is one of the complications with having a child. It makes dating a lot more complicated. She is also training to be a chef, that is her focus in school and what she wants to focus on when she gets into college, and I just loved all the passages in this book about food. I read The Supper Club by Lara Williams last month, which is a very different book, but it's also a book that has this incredibly vivid, rich description of food, and I guess that's something I'm into now. I loved the passion that our main character had for her work, and I loved watching her journey of learning what it means to be a good chef and learning from all these influences around her. Our main character goes through so much growth in this book, like you do when you're like 17, 18. Never mind when you have another factor to consider in being a mother. I actually listened to this one on an audiobook, which is read by the author herself, which, you know, always helps. This one might be told in verse, I'm not entirely sure, but I know this is the same author who wrote The Poet X, which I know is told in verse. I don't think I've ever actually read a YA book from the perspective of a young parent, so this was a really unique reading experience for me, and it's something that I would love to read more about as well. I only read one non-fiction book this month, which is a little bit less than I normally read, but that was We Are Never Meeting in Real Life by Samantha Irby. This is an essay collection. Some of the topics tackled in this book include the intersection of Samantha Irby's identities as both a queer woman and a person of colour. It looks at her sexual experiences from the awkward and uncomfortable to the unpleasant to the dangerous, and to topics that could be quite triggering, so be aware of that if you are going into this book. It looks at her relationship with her body image, and she isn't afraid to talk about any of these things in really explicit terms. Like, it's very vivid and visceral at points. As well as dealing with those serious topics, there is some light and shade to this book. There are a lot of funny moments, but I think an issue for me with this book is our senses of humour don't really gel. I found a lot of the humour in this book quite forced, but you might get on with that sense of humour a lot more than I did. I would be intrigued to read another of this writer's essay collections. I think she's got like 2 or 3 more. What I will say that is massively in this book's favour is sometimes when you read essay collections, It doesn't feel like there's a real flow to them. Like it doesn't feel like the jigsaw fits together, whereas in this collection it really did. It really made sense how all of the essays were organized, how they were put together, why they were in the same book together. So yeah, not hugely for me, but I would be interested in reading more from this writer. Moving on to the fiction for grown-ups, this month I read 1,000 Ships by Natalie Haynes. I loved this book. I think this is one of my favourite books I've read all year. I know we're only in February, but like I haven't had that book yet. That book where you finish it and you're like, I immediately want to read this again. I love this book. This is definitely going to be one of my favourite books of the year. I haven't had that yet, and this wasn't quite it, but it was so almost there. This is the story of the Trojan War, but told from the perspective of women and giving voice to the women in that story. With these ancient Greek stories, so often the men take centre stage with the women as side characters, and this repositions the narrative with these women as the integral main characters of this story. There are a lot of books out there that are doing kind of similar things or aim to do similar things. There has been this real Greek literature trend in the past couple of years with like Madeline Miller's books, with The Silence of the Girls by Pat Barker, but I think this book is so much better than both of those. Mainly because I found a real disconnect with some of those other books because I wasn't already familiar with the stories. Like I could understand what was happening, but it did just feel like there was some stuff that I wasn't getting, and everything is woven in so seamlessly to this book where you are given little bits of context and explanation of the characters that you're looking at and how they are related to other characters that you may know or that you've met in previous chapters. This book is also so witty. Like there are so many lines in it that I just wanted to underline. There was one chapter in particular that's like maybe a third of the way through the book. It's chapter 12. And like honestly, I think this is one of my favourite chapters of any book that I've ever read. Like I don't think I've ever had that before where I've been like, this is just a really great chapter. If you're into these like Greek retelling stories, I cannot recommend this highly enough, and particularly if you, like me, felt a little bit of disconnect with some other Greek retellings that you've read, this one was just a total next level for me. Another retelling of an older story is Hagseed by Margaret Atwood, and this is a retelling of The Tempest. I've not read a huge amount of Shakespeare, but I have read The Tempest, and I'm not sure if you need to have read The Tempest to get this book. I do think there are some areas of like exposition and explanation of the play that I ended up kind of skimming over a little bit. This predominantly follows a director or former director named Felix who lost his position as the director of The Tempest on the night before it was being shown, and after that he is full of these feelings of wanting revenge. 12 years later he is working at a prison teaching a theatre course to inmates, and they are going to put on a production of The Tempest. I loved that setup. I thought it was such an interesting perspective to read from. I really love reading books about prisons. The parts of the play where they're rehearsing and we're spending time with the inmates, I really enjoyed those parts. Felix's story, however, I had less interest in. Climax of this book, very unbelievable. But in saying that, it is a Shakespeare retelling. Shakespeare doesn't always make that much sense, and it isn't always realistic. I thought this was an enjoyable read. I liked it a lot. It's definitely not going to be a favourite for me, and I definitely don't think it's Margaret Atwood at her best, but I did think it was a fun read. Next I read The Bookish Life of Nina Hill by Abby Waxman. This is kind of a romance novel, I guess. It's like contemporary women's fiction. This reminded me slightly of a book that I kind of hate read in January called The Book Ninja, because it also follows a young woman who works in a bookshop who loves that job. She's obsessed with reading, and there are literary references scattered throughout this book. I do think this book was much better than the one I read in January, but in a way I feel like it was less fun. There are two sort of main plot threads in Nina's life for the duration of this book. One of those is her coming out of her shell a little bit more, starting dating, particularly this guy Tom, who is on a rival trivia team to her trivia team. It's about her beginning to open up to the idea of there being someone else in her life other than her cat and her books. The other side of the plot is Nina has recently found out who her biological father is, because he has passed away, She has been left some money in his will, and through that she ends up meeting these like half brothers and sisters and nieces and nephews that she didn't know she had, and this is quite overwhelming for Deena as someone who is quite happy to spend time on her own. I thought this was an enjoyable enough read, but I don't really think I got anything out of it. But I am still really glad to be exploring this genre a little bit more. I did it! I read White Teeth by Zadie Smith after it being sat on my TBR for literal years and me avoiding it because it's so big. In this mammoth of a novel, we are following two families that are headed by Samad and Archie. We follow these two men, but also subsequent generations of their family, and one of the main overarching things this book is looking at is a sense of identity, what it's like to have a mixed identity, what it is like to live in Britain, but specifically living in London as a person of colour, from microaggressions all the way to like overt, blatantly obvious racism. There is so much covered in this book, and that is kind of the only thing that I can criticise about it, is that I felt like there was too much in here. And like, this is Zadie Smith's debut novel, and I feel like she had so much to say about all of these topics and she just put it in one novel, and it is so accomplished, and I think that's what would make this book so great to study, and I know it is studied in schools now. I can only imagine she has given some of these topics a lot more space to breathe in like her subsequent work. I am really glad that I've eventually read this book, and if it is something that intrigues you, I would recommend getting around to it. I think it is really one of those books that you should read, even though there are no books that you should read. But I do think, like, if you want to expand your worldview and read from a lot of different perspectives that are different to your own, then this is just a great book for that. This month I also read The Tiny Wife by Andrew Kaufman. I had read his short story collection, All My Friends Are Superheroes, and if you've read that book, you will definitely love this book as well. I borrowed this from my friend Vic when I went to stay with her during the month, and it is such a quick, enjoyable, quirky read. This book opens with a man going into a bank with a gun, but rather than demanding money, he demands an object of sentimental value from each of the people that are in the bank. Once that has passed and he's left and everyone in the bank is fine, really strange things start happening. There is, for instance, a woman who starts to turn into sweets, turn into candy. There is a woman whose husband wakes up as a snowman. And those sections are kind of almost mini short stories in themselves. And then there is an overarching plot of one of the men who is there, his wife starts shrinking, hence the title, The Tiny Wife. It was really interesting discussing this book with my friend Vic afterwards. You may, if you've been on this channel a while, you may know Vic from my video on how to make the book industry more eco-friendly. I'll leave that linked down below if you haven't, but it was really interesting discussing the book with her afterwards, and I think a lot of the little short stories, they act as metaphors for something else that is going on in this person's life. Some of them I found a little bit, on the nose, but I actually think there's something very satisfying about that. A lot of metaphors can feel like untouchable, like you can't grasp them, whereas these felt like an enjoyable puzzle to figure out. If anyone else has read this book, I would love to have a chat about it down in the comments, because as I said, I just had the best time discussing it. I don't think it's like one of the best books I've ever read, but it was certainly very enjoyable, and if you are into like quirky, slightly whimsical stories, then I think you'll like this one. Next I have the one book that I managed to read for Thrillerathon, and that is Little Friends by Jane Shemmelt. This book is about three families that become friends when Eve, one of the main viewpoints that we have in this book, starts a class for tutoring dyslexic children. When the kids all become friends, it means that subsequently their parents become friends. On the surface, everything is like quite picturesque. Everyone seems to be getting along, go to dinner parties and go on holiday together. Then a tragedy occurs that affects all of the families. And this book looks at, you never really know what's going on behind closed doors. Except my one issue with this book is I could kind of tell what was going on behind closed doors. I feel like there are two major twists in this book, and I saw them coming very early on. And because of that, it is kind of difficult for me to talk about this book, because ultimately what I want from a thriller is to be shocked. Like, I want a visceral reaction of being surprised. Of like, I didn't see that coming, but now everything makes sense. Whereas I saw some of the stuff coming. I guess reading this book just left me unsatisfied. I thought the writing was really good. I really enjoyed the author's writing style. I really like how seamlessly she flicks between the different perspectives, and there are some very important topics dealt with in this book. If you are someone that reads a lot of thrillers, you might like this one more than I did if you've enjoyed this author's previous books. I feel like I'm just very difficult to please when it comes to thrillers because there's like a tiny percentage of them that I actually like, but I will keep trying with them. In February, I also read The Guernsey Literary and Potato Pea Pie Society by Mary Ann Schaefer and Annie Barrows. This was one of the books I included in my 5-star predictions video, and it didn't quite meet 5 stars for me, but I did find it enjoyable and very charming. This is set in the 1940s and it follows an author who is struggling to come up with an idea for her next book. Out of the blue, she receives a letter from someone who is telling her that they have recently come into possession of a book that used to belong to her, and they begin corresponding about their love of fantastic books. He then tells her that he is a member of something called the Guernsey Literary and Potato Pea Pie Society, and her interest is piqued in this and she begins to learn a lot more about it, ask a lot of questions about it. Eventually, other people from the society begin to write her letters and tell her about their experiences, and she begins to build up a broader picture of what it was like for the people of Guernsey to live under German occupation in the war. I thought this book was very charming. It was full of quirky character. I did kind of struggle to keep up with who was who, but that's, you know, a problem with me and these kind of letter writing books. I did think it was great. I thought it was a really uplifting novel. If you are interested in like World War stories, then I would recommend it because it gives such a different perspective to books that are focused on like the fighting and the war itself. Like this book is far more like it's much quieter. So yeah, not my favourite, but I would definitely still recommend it. The final book that I have to talk to you guys about is the only poetry collection that I read in February, and that is Inkstone by Jamie McKendrick. Never read anything from this poet before, didn't really know what I was getting into when I went into this collection, but I did enjoy it quite a lot. This is a book that looks at the natural world in such a unique way and with such fine detail. It looks at things in the natural world and showcases what is strange and uncanny about them. As for the writing style in these poems, I thought there was such a subtle and fantastic use of rhyme throughout it. One of my favourite things that can happen in poetry is when you have like an internal rhyme and you read a line and you know there's a rhyme there but it's not immediately obvious where it is. I'm not hugely interested in poetry about nature, so this isn't a favourite, but at the same time the way this poet uses sound and uses language was something that massively appeals to me. So that's it. They are all of the books that I read in February. Do leave me a comment down below and let me know if you've read any of these books and we can share thoughts on them, or let me know what you're currently reading or if you're participating in the Irish Readathon. I hope you guys are doing well and I will talk to you in my next video.